The air in Pine Hill Avenue always smelled faintly of cut grass and grilled meat in summer. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone waved even if they didn't mean it, and the biggest scandal anyone remembered was the Johnsons' dog running off with a mail carrier's shoe. To an outsider, it was a slice of quiet perfection. For Marianne Clark, 42 and well-practiced in the art of smiling through emptiness, it was a glass cage. Her husband, David, was dependable in all the ways that made other wives envious. Steady job, polished manners, no late nights. Her daughter, Emily, was 15, sharp-tongued and distracted by her phone. The days blurred into routines, school drop-offs, grocery lists, polite dinners with too much silence between bites. That Saturday, the neighborhood gathered for the annual summer barbecue. Folding tables lined the Walsh's backyard, heavy with potato salad and beer bottles. The air shimmered with heat and laughter. Marianne moved among the guests with her usual grace, complimenting dresses, passing napkins, pretending not to notice that David hadn't looked at her once in an hour. She was reaching for a tray of burgers when she heard a voice behind her. "Need a hand with that?" She turned, and for a moment forgot to breathe. Ethan Walsh stood there, taller than she remembered, his boyish face sharpened by time. The last she'd seen him, he was a lanky teenager mowing his parents' lawn. Now, at 21, there was something different, an ease in his smile, a quiet confidence that didn't belong to the child she remembered. "Oh, Ethan, you're back," she said, her voice too bright. "Just for the summer," he replied, taking the tray from her hands. "Mom said you'd probably organize half this thing." She laughed softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "That sounds like her." Their eyes met for a second too long. Then someone called her name, and the spell broke. The afternoon unfolded in easy rhythm, music, chatter, the sizzle of meat on the grill. But every now and then, Marianne caught Ethan glancing her way. It wasn't overt, just fleeting moments that lingered in her mind longer than they should have. She told herself it was nothing. She was old enough to know better. When the sun began to set, streaking the sky in gold and pink, Marianne stood at the edge of the yard watching fireflies blink to life. David was deep in conversation with another neighbor, laughing, a sound that once warmed her, but now only echoed how distant they'd become. Ethan joined her, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "Peaceful, isn't it?" "It is," she said, taking one. "Almost too peaceful sometimes." He smiled, curious. "Too peaceful?" She hesitated, then forced a light laugh. "Just means you start to notice the little things. The cracks." He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he should. "Cracks can be interesting." Marianne turned to him, surprised by the maturity in his tone. There was no teasing in his eyes, just an intensity that unsettled her. She looked away quickly, murmuring, "You'll find Pine Hill boring after college life." "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes boring is what people call safe." For a moment, neither spoke. The night hummed with distant cicadas. Marianne felt a strange flicker inside her, part curiosity, part warning. She told herself it was the wine, the heat, the loneliness she never admitted aloud. When she finally left the barbecue, David was walking ahead, chatting with another couple. Ethan lingered by the gate, hands in his pockets, eyes following her. "Good night, Mrs. Clark," he said softly. The sound of it, his voice low, deliberate, sent a pulse through her chest she couldn't explain. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, forcing a smile before turning away. But as she walked home under the streetlights, the quiet suburb didn't feel quite so quiet anymore. Something unseen had shifted, something that would soon break the calm forever. The following week unfolded with the same calm predictability Pine Hill Avenue was known for. Lawns trimmed, sprinklers hissing in the heat, mailboxes clicking shut at the same hour. Yet for Marianne Clark, something small but undeniable had changed. It began with a sound, the scrape of a ladder against the fence. From her kitchen window, she saw Ethan balancing at the top, hammer in hand, fixing a loose panel. His parents had left for a 2-week vacation in Maine, and he had promised to keep an eye on the place. Marianne opened the back door. "You'll fall if you keep leaning like that," she called. He glanced down, grinning. "Then I guess you'll have to catch me." She laughed, shaking her head. But something about his confidence unsettled her, playful but not childish. When the panel came loose completely, she stepped forward to steady it, their hands brushing briefly. A tiny spark ran through her like static. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter now. "Didn't mean to cause trouble." "You're not," she murmured, though she wasn't sure what she meant anymore. Over the next few days, Ethan found reasons to stop by, trimming her hedge, repainting a patch of the fence, carrying groceries from her car. Each visit lasted a little longer than it should have. Their conversations drifted from casual talk to more personal ground, her garden, his college life, books, music. Marianne began to notice details she shouldn't. The way his hair fell over his forehead when he worked, the earnestness in his questions, the way he listened as if every word she said mattered. At night, she caught herself replaying their talks, then scolding herself for it. David, meanwhile, was more distant than ever. Work kept him late, and when he came home he moved like a ghost through their shared space, polite, predictable, unreachable. Dinner conversations had become practical exchange. Bills, repairs, Emily's grades. Love had been replaced by quiet efficiency. One evening, as the sun melted behind the trees, Marianne found Ethan sitting on the fence, strumming an old guitar. The sound drifted through the warm air, soft and unguarded. She stepped outside, drawn by it. "That's beautiful," she said. He looked up, smiling. "Didn't think anyone was listening." "I was," she said. "I always seem to be." He tilted his head, studying her face. "You look tired sometimes." Marianne blinked, caught off guard. "Tired?" He shrugged. "Not the kind of tired sleep fixes." The words lingered between them, heavy and dangerous. For a heartbeat the world felt still. The breeze, the cicadas, the faint hum of traffic fading away. She wanted to step back, but instead she found herself saying softly, "You notice too much for your age." "Maybe," he said, smiling again. "Or maybe everyone else just stops noticing." The moment broke when Emily called from inside, asking for dinner. Marianne turned quickly, forcing composure. "Good night, Ethan," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Good night, Mrs. Clark," he replied, but his gaze followed her as she walked away. Inside, the clatter of dishes and David's quiet footsteps filled the house. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. Later, as she closed the curtains, Marianne caught a glimpse of movement outside. Ethan walking back toward his porch, guitar slung over his shoulder. He paused once and looked toward her window. Just a faint smile across the fence, and somehow it was enough to keep her awake the rest of the night. The storm began earlier than expected. By dusk, Pine Hill Avenue was drowning in rain. Wind pressed hard against the windows, and thunder rolled low and steady like a warning. Marianne stood at her sink, watching sheets of water blur the fence that divided her yard from the Walshes. She almost missed the figure running across the lawn, soaked, hunched against the downpour. Ethan. He reached her porch, knocking once before she could even process what she was seeing. When she opened the door, rain blew in around him. His hair was plastered to his forehead, shirt clinging to his frame. "I was helping Mrs. Turner with her gutters," he said breathlessly. "Didn't think it would hit this fast." "You'll catch pneumonia out there," Marianne said. "Come in, quickly." He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside. Water pooled at his feet. She handed him a towel, avoiding his eyes. "You can wait until it slows down." "Thanks," he murmured. He rubbed at his hair, laughter slipping from him. Guess I picked the wrong day to play handyman. She smiled despite herself. You never learn. For a moment it was easy. The simple warmth of shelter, the sound of rain on glass. She made tea while he stood by the window, looking out at the storm. The light from the kitchen fell across his face, softening his features. When she brought him a mug, their fingers brushed. Neither moved away. Marianne, he said quietly. It was the first time he'd ever said her name without Mrs. attached. Something inside her jolted. She should have told him to stop, to sit down, to remember his age and her vows. But the words caught in her throat. He was looking at her not with boyish boldness, but with something deeper, an understanding she hadn't felt from anyone in years. She turned away. You should dry your clothes. I'll get you something. Don't, he said softly. You'll just pretend. You don't feel this? Her hands froze on the counter. The house seemed to hold its breath. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating them both in pale light. Ethan. He stepped closer, the air between them charged and trembling. You don't have to say anything, he whispered. I just... Before she could stop herself, she turned, and their lips met. It was quick, startled, but it shattered everything that had been holding her together. She pushed him back at first, whispering his name like an apology, but then she kissed him again, harder this time, the storm roaring louder as if to drown their guilt. They moved with desperate need, the months of restraint collapsing in an instant. The rain outside blurred into a rush of white noise, the world narrowing to skin, breath, and the pulse of something forbidden. When it was over, silence filled the house. The storm had eased, leaving only the soft tap of rain on the roof. Marianne sat on the edge of the couch, the towel clutched in her hands. Ethan watched her from across the room, expression unreadable. I should go, he said finally. She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. Yes, before anyone sees. He hesitated at the door. You don't regret it, do you? She opened her mouth but couldn't form an answer. He left before she could try. When the door clicked shut, Marianne sank back into the quiet. Her heart was racing, her hands trembling. The house smelled of rain and guilt. She pressed her palms to her face, whispering to herself, it was a mistake, just one mistake. But even as she said it, part of her already knew the truth. It wouldn't be the last. The days after the storm carried an uneasy stillness. Pine Hill Avenue gleamed under the sun again. But for Marianne, the air felt heavy, thick with a secret that followed her everywhere. Each morning she woke with the same confusion, guilt clawing at one side of her mind, desire whispering from the other. She tried to return to her old rhythm, laundry, errands, family dinners, but the routine now felt like a performance. David noticed the change before she realized she was slipping. You've been different lately, he said one evening, setting down his fork. More distracted. Marianne forced a smile. Just tired, that's all. Work's been busy. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on her longer than usual. She could feel his quiet suspicion pressing against her every word. When he left for work the next morning, she stood by the window, watching his car disappear down the street, and let herself breathe again. Her hands trembled slightly as she texted Ethan, You shouldn't come over today. His reply came instantly. I wasn't planning to, but I miss you. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The risk had grown too real, yet the thought of losing that stolen connection terrified her more than being caught. Across the fence, Caroline Walsh was beginning to notice changes of her own. Ethan's mood had turned restless. He lingered around the house, checking his phone every few minutes, snapping when she asked simple questions. Is something going on with you? She asked one afternoon. No, he muttered, not meeting her eyes. You've been off lately? She pressed gently. If it's a girl, "Mum, drop it," he said sharply, leaving the room before she could finish. Caroline stood there in silence, uneasy. She hadn't seen him this tense since high school, like he was carrying something too big for his shoulders. By the end of the week, the neighborhood chatter had begun. Pine Hill. His peace was delicate. It didn't take much to fracture it. Someone mentioned seeing Marianne at the grocery store twice in one day. Another whispered that she'd been spotted walking near the park alone, her face flushed, her smile distracted. None of it meant anything. But together, it meant everything. David overheard snippets at the local hardware store. Harmless gossip, he told himself. Still, when he got home, he found himself scanning her expressions, her tone, her clothes. Once, he caught the faintest trace of perfume that wasn't hers, or perhaps hadn't been worn in years. That night, as they watched television, Marianne laughed at something on screen. A soft, unguarded sound he hadn't heard in months. But instead of warming him, it unsettled him. It was the laugh of someone remembering another life. When the episode ended, he muted the TV. "Who makes you laugh like that?" he asked suddenly. She froze. "What?" "You heard me." Marianne forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're being ridiculous." David said nothing more, but the question hung in the silence like smoke. Later, as she stood at the kitchen sink rinsing her glass, she saw movement through the window. Ethan in his yard, leaning against the fence, phone glowing in his hand. Their eyes met briefly, before she turned away, heart pounding. Neither waved, neither smiled. But that single glance said everything. The secret still lived, and sooner or later, the world around them would start to see the shadows it cast. The silence between them didn't last. It never could. At first it was harmless, an occasional text from Ethan. "Just checking if you're okay. You looked sad today." Little gestures that could be mistaken for care. But soon the tone changed. The messages came late at night, when the house was still, and her husband slept beside her. "I can't stop thinking about you. Do you ever think about me too? Why are you ignoring me?" Marianne would stare at the glowing screen in the dark, her heart hammering as she typed, "You need to stop this. Someone will find out." Then she would delete it before sending. By morning, she'd convince herself to reply with something neutral. "I'm fine, Ethan. Please focus on your classes." But Ethan wasn't fine. He began showing up unexpectedly, appearing at the grocery store, at the park, even by her fence when she took out the trash. Each time, he'd act casual, smiling as if it were coincidence. But she knew better. His eyes gave him away, that feverish, hungry look that made her both guilty and frightened. One evening she found a note slipped under her door. "I can't lose you." The handwriting was unmistakable. Her pulse raced as she crumpled it, terrified that David or Emily might see. The next day she confronted him near the fence. "You can't do this," she whispered harshly. "Someone will notice." Ethan looked at her with hurt and confusion. "You said you cared about me." "I did, but it has to stop." He stepped closer, voice trembling. "You don't mean that. You think about me, I know you do." She backed away. "You're young, Ethan. This was wrong from the start." He laughed bitterly. "Wrong? You didn't think it was wrong that night?" The words hit her like a slap. "Don't twist this. Please, Ethan." He stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "If you walk away from me, I'll tell him. Your husband. Everyone." Her breath caught. "Sheesh, you wouldn't." "Try me," he said, eyes glinting with something dark. Marianne felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This wasn't the same boy she'd first seen across the barbecue table. That boy had been curious, kind, This one was something else, consumed, dangerous, desperate to hold on to something that was already unraveling. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. She hid her phone in the drawer, terrified David might find a message she'd missed deleting. The guilt was unbearable, but the fear was worse. The next morning, she drove to the other side of town, parking behind an empty cafe. She finally texted him, "We need to stop this before it destroys us both." The reply came instantly. "Too late for that. You already destroyed me." For the next few days, Ethan didn't appear. No texts, no glimpses by the fence. The silence was a relief, but also unnerving. Every time her phone buzzed, her stomach clenched. Every car door outside made her glance through the blinds. Then one afternoon, she came home to find her garden gate slightly open and a single photo pinned to it. A picture of her and Ethan from weeks earlier, laughing in the yard. On the back, in black ink, was a single line, "You can't erase me." Marianne dropped the photo, her fingers shaking. Panic washed through her chest. Somewhere behind the curtains she thought she saw movement, or maybe just shadows. She knew with sick certainty that it wasn't over. Ethan wasn't going to let her go, and if he couldn't have her quietly, he'd make sure the whole neighborhood knew. David Clark had always trusted routine. It was the quiet rhythm of their life that comforted him. Morning coffee at 7, work by 8, dinner at 6. But lately, the pattern was breaking. Marianne's smiles came too easily, her explanations too quickly. She was gone longer on errands, came home smelling faintly of rain, and something sweet he didn't recognize. It began with a phone call. David answered the landline one evening when Marianne was out getting groceries. A man asked for her by name, then hung up as soon as David spoke. He brushed it off, but when he checked their shared phone bill later that week, he noticed a series of unfamiliar numbers. Short calls, odd times. At first he tried to explain it away. Maybe a client from her volunteer work. Maybe Emily's friends using her phone. But the unease settled in, slow and corrosive. The next clue came folded inside a grocery bag, a receipt from a cafe across town. The date and time placed her there when she'd told him she was meeting her sister. He stared at it for a long time before tucking it into his wallet. He wanted to ask her directly, to demand answers, but something inside him whispered to wait, to watch. A few nights later, as they sat at dinner, Marianne's phone lit up on the counter. The name on the screen was hidden under a simple first initial, E. Her hand darted toward it too fast, muttering something about Emily's school project. David nodded, pretending not to notice the tremor in her voice. By the end of the week, he could no longer ignore the pit in his stomach. At lunch the next day he called an old friend, Paul Jenkins, Private Investigations. He'd never imagined himself the kind of man who'd need someone followed, yet here he was, whispering in his car like a criminal. "I don't want anything drastic," David said. "Just find out where she goes when she says she's running errands." Paul didn't ask for details. "Give me a week." That week felt like a year. Marianne moved around him with the same gentle warmth, but now every smile looked rehearsed, every touch calculated. He found himself studying her reflection in the mirror, wondering when she'd become a stranger. 7 days later, the report arrived in a brown envelope. David sat alone in his car, parked behind his office, and opened it with shaking hands. Inside were photographs. The first few were harmless. Marianne leaving the house, walking through town. But then came the one that stole his breath. Marianne at the park, her hand brushing the shoulder of Ethan Walsh, the neighbor's son. In another, they stood close, laughing. The last photo cut through him like a blade. Behind the Walsh's garage, Ethan's hand in hers, their heads tilted together in a moment too intimate to misread. David stared at the images until his vision blurred. It wasn't anger that hit him first. It was disbelief. The boy who'd once mowed their lawn. The young man he'd chatted with about college applications. He thought of the whispers he'd heard at the hardware store, the way Marianne avoided his eyes, the perfume that didn't belong. It all snapped into place, like glass breaking. When he finally drove home that night, he didn't confront her. Not yet. She greeted him with the same careful affection, kissed his cheek, asked about his day. David smiled back. He needed time to think, to plan. As she turned away, the smile slipped from his face. His eyes followed her quietly, coldly. Whatever this was, he thought, it would end soon. For 3 days after receiving the photographs, David lived in silence, the kind that hums behind the ribs, heavy and poisonous. Every moment felt staged, every conversation a fragile performance. He would watch her move through the kitchen, humming softly, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables or folded laundry. How could she appear so calm while his world was collapsing? At night, he lay awake beside her, his eyes tracing the ceiling in the dark. He remembered the laughter that used to fill their home, Emily's tiny footsteps, Marianne's gentle hum while watering the plants. Now, all he could hear was the echo of her lie. By the 4th evening, David knew what he had to do. The quiet had turned into something unbearable. The images haunted him. Her smile, Ethan's face, the way her body leaned toward him like gravity itself was pulling them together. That night, rain came again. The same kind that had once trapped Marianne and Ethan together. It fell against the windows in soft waves as David sat at the kitchen table, lights off, a bottle of whiskey half empty beside him. The photographs were laid out before him like evidence in a courtroom. He waited. When Marianne's car finally pulled into the driveway, headlights sweeping across the living room walls, David didn't move. She entered quietly, shaking the rain from her hair, muttering about traffic. Then she saw him, sitting there in the dark. "David?" she said, hesitant. "Why are you—" He didn't answer. He simply flicked on the light. The sudden brightness revealed the table, the photos spread out like a crime scene. Marianne froze. Her keys slipped from her hand, clattering against the tile. What is this?" she whispered. David's voice was low, steady, too calm. "You tell me." Her eyes darted across the images, her and Ethan, laughing, touching, holding hands. Color drained from her face. "It's not... David, this isn't what it looks like." He let out a bitter laugh. "Don't insult me. I've seen enough to know exactly what it looks like." She took a step forward. "It was a mistake. I didn't mean for..." "Didn't mean for what?" His voice rose now, trembling with rage. "Didn't mean to betray me. To humiliate me with a boy half your age." "Stop!" she shouted, tears already forming. "You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," he cut her off. "You threw away 20 years of marriage for a thrill. For him." The air was electric, thick with grief and fury. Marianne reached for the photos, but he slammed his hand down on them. One glass from the table toppled, shattering on the floor. "You think I didn't notice?" he roared. "The perfume, the late nights, the smiles you saved for someone else." Her sob broke through the noise. "It wasn't supposed to happen, David. I was lonely and you stopped seeing me. You stopped caring." The confession hit him harder than the betrayal itself. For a moment neither spoke. Only the rain filled the silence. David's breathing slowed, but his eyes stayed hard. "So that's your excuse? My neglect? That gives you the right to crawl into bed with a kid who used to mow our lawn?" Marianne covered her face with her hands. "Please stop." But he couldn't. The dam had broken. "You ruined everything!" he shouted, sweeping the photos off the table. They fluttered through the air like torn wings. "You ruined this family!" In her panic, Marianne tried to grab his arm. "David, please." He pulled away, his voice raw. "Does Emily know? Does she know her mother's sleeping with Ethan Walsh?" The name echoed. Ethan. It filled the room like thunder. Marianne's eyes widened with terror. Please don't say his name." But it was too late. The word hung between them, poisonous and alive. Outside, lightning split the sig. "Key." Inside, the silence after the storm was worse than the shouting. Marianne backed toward the door, trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. David stared at her. The woman he once loved, now unrecognizable. "You already crossed too far," he said quietly. Neither noticed the curtain shift slightly, or the shadow outside the window, someone listening, unseen, as Ethan's name lingered in the air. Marianne didn't remember grabbing her coat or keys. One moment she was standing in the living room, the next she was outside, running through the rain, breath trembling in her throat. Behind her, the lights of her house glowed dimly through the storm, a place that no longer felt like home. She could still hear David's voice echoing in her head. "You ruined this family." The rage, the pain, the way his eyes had gone hollow. The streets were slick with water as she stumbled toward the Walsh house, heart pounding so violently she thought it might burst. When Ethan opened the door, confusion and fear crossed his face. "Marianne? What happened?" She collapsed into his arms, trembling. "He knows," she gasped. "David knows everything. He had pictures, Ethan. He's not himself. I think he might hurt me." Ethan pulled her inside, slamming the door shut against the wind. His jaw tightened, his pulse racing as he held her close. "You're safe here," he said, though his voice betrayed his own fear. "He's not coming near you." "I won't let him." Marianne looked up at him, drenched, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "You don't understand. He's angry enough to—" Ethan interrupted, voice sharp with determination. "I don't care. If he comes here, I'll deal with him." She shook her head violently. "Ethan, no, you can't." But the more she begged, the more his resolve hardened. The adrenaline, the months of secrecy, the humiliation of being called a boy, it all fused into something dangerous. He led her to the couch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the thunder outside. The house smelled faintly of rain and aftershave. Marianne's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. "I didn't mean for any of this," she whispered. "It was supposed to stop." Ethan turned toward her, eyes burning with something close to desperation. "You don't mean that." She hesitated. "Ethan, you still love me," he said. "You came here. You chose me." "It's not that simple," she said softly, looking away. "You're too young to understand what this really means." His expression darkened. "Too young," he repeated. "That's what he said, isn't it? That I'm just some stupid kid." "Ethan, please." He stood abruptly, pacing. "You keep saying you didn't mean for this, but you kissed me first. You told me I made you feel alive again. And now, what? You want to pretend it never happened?" Her voice trembled. "I just want to fix what's left of my life." The words sliced through him. Something in his chest cracked open. Pain, anger, rejection, all colliding. "So I'm just a mistake now?" Marianne rose, tears welling. "Ethan, stop. You're scaring me." He froze, realizing the shift in her tone. Fear. She was afraid of him. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing through the window. His voice softened, pleading. "I didn't mean to scare you. I love you, Marianne. I'd do anything for you." She tried to calm him. "I know, but it has to end. If David calls the police— "The police?" he snapped, eyes wide. "You think I care about that?" She reached for her phone on the table, but his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. "Don't," he said sharply. The air thickened. Marianne's pulse quickened. "Ethan, let me go." He released her, stepping back, running a hand through his soaked hair. "I'm sorry. I just—" Then came the sound, a thud from the porch. Someone outside. They both froze. "Ethan," she whispered. "He's here. He's here," and moved toward the window, his shadow trembling against the lightning. Outside, a dark figure stood near the gate, motionless. Marianne backed away, voice shaking. "Ethan, don't go out there, please." But he was already moving. "He's not taking you from me," he said, his tone low, final. Moments later, neighbors would recall hearing shouting, a woman's scream, a crash of glass, and then silence, swallowed by rain. The storm had passed, but Pine Hill Avenue was far from quiet. Flashing red and blue lights painted the Walsh driveway as officers cordoned off the scene. Curious neighbors huddled under umbrellas, whispering, their faces pale in the glow. The once peaceful street, the place where children had played and laughter echoed, now throbbed with sirens and fear. Inside, chaos. The living room was a battlefield, furniture toppled, shattered glass glittering under harsh floodlights. The air smelled of iron and rain. A dark pool spread slowly across the white tile, thick and glistening. Officer Ramirez crouched near the body first. Ethan Walsh lay sprawled on the floor, his shirt soaked crimson, chest rising faintly with shallow, ragged breaths. His fingers twitched once, then fell still. "Get paramedics in here!" Ramirez shouted. 2 EMTs rushed forward, kneeling beside Ethan, their gloves moving fast and precise, but his pulse was fading. On the floor beside him, a kitchen knife gleamed, wiped once, but not well enough. The handle was slick with fingerprints. Across the room, Marianne Clark sat against the wall, trembling. Her hair clung to her face, her blouse torn, streaks of blood on her arms that weren't hers. She rocked back and forth, whispering the same words again and again. "He came at us. I had to. He came at us." Detective Lorna Hayes, a seasoned woman with steady eyes, crouched beside her. "Mrs. Clark, can you hear me?" Marianne's gaze flickered upward. Her pupils were wide, lost. "He tried to kill us," she said, voice hoarse. "David, he came here. He had a knife." "Your husband?" Hayes asked calmly. Marianne nodded. "He was shouting. I don't even remember grabbing it. He attacked Ethan. She broke down, sobbing. "I didn't mean to." Behind them, officers moved carefully through the wreckage. Ramirez held up a cell phone in a plastic bag. "Detective, found this near the couch. Belongs to her, I think." Hayes gave a nod, but kept her attention on Marianne. "We'll get this sorted out, okay? But I need you to breathe." Marianne tried, gasping, her chest rising unevenly. "Please, you have to believe me. He would have killed us both." Hayes studied her. The smeared makeup, trembling hands, the faint smell of whiskey and fear. Something didn't add up. "Where's your husband now?" Marianne hesitated. "He ran," she said, eyes darting toward the door. "When he saw Ethan fall, he ran." The detective glanced at Ramirez. "Get units searching the area." But outside, no one had seen David Clark leave. His car was still in his driveway, doors locked. No footprints led away from the house. Inside, one of the paramedics looked up grimly. "Detective, we've got massive blood loss here. Multiple stab wounds. Looks like 3, maybe 4. Hayes turned back to Marianne. "You said he came at you both. Did you see David with the knife?" Marianne nodded too quickly. Yes, he had it. He swung at Ethan. I screamed. She pressed her palms against her temples, sobbing harder. "It happened so fast." Hayes looked toward the evidence tech who had just bagged the knife. "Prints?" The tech shook his head. "Only one set, Detective. All hers." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "And no prints from the husband?" "None visible. No sign of forced entry either. Front door was unlocked." Hayes stood, the pieces twisting in her mind. The missing husband, the calm, suburban woman drenched in blood, the boy on the floor who'd once been the neighbor's son. Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance, soft and far away. Marianne suddenly screamed, clutching at her knees. "He'll come back! You don't understand! He'll come back!" Hayes motioned for an officer. "Get her to the hospital. She's in shock." As they lifted Marianne to her feet, she glanced once more toward Ethan's still body. Her lips trembled. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she whispered, barely audible. "I just wanted it to stop." But Hayes heard, and the words stayed with her long after Marianne was gone. When the officers cleared the scene, Hayes lingered by the knife bagged on the floor. She crouched, studying the faint trail of blood leading away from it, not toward the door, but toward where Marianne had been sitting. And in that quiet, flickering moment, Hayes knew something in this story was very wrong. The room was small, sterile, and humming with fluorescent light. Marianne Clark sat at the metal table, her reflection fractured in its surface. Her clothes had been replaced with a grey hoodie. Her hands trembled, faint traces of blood still visible around her nails. Stubborn reminders of the night before. Across from her sat Detective Lorna Hayes, recorder on, pen steady in hand. The clock on the wall ticked with surgical precision. "Mrs. Clark," Hayes began softly, "you've said your husband attacked you and Ethan Walsh. But our officers searched the neighborhood. No trace of David Clark anywhere. His car hasn't moved. His phone hasn't pinged once in 12 hours. Marianne's eyes flickered upward. "He's hiding," she whispered. "He always hides when he's angry." Hayes leaned forward. "Marianne, the gate camera from the Walsh property shows you arriving alone at 9:27 p.m. No one else came or left that house until police arrived. Can you explain that?" Marianne froze. The hum of the lights grew louder, pressing against her ears. "He came in through the back," she said after a pause. "Maybe he parked somewhere else." "Through the back?" Hayes asked gently. "The back gate was locked from the inside, and your fingerprints were the only ones on," which Marianne's throat tightened. "You think I'm lying?" "I think you're scared," Hayes said, "but I also think you're protecting someone. Maybe yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Marianne's gaze drifted toward the one-way glass, as though she could see the world beyond it. The flashing lights, the chaos, the gossip brewing just outside the station walls. Her reflection stared back, tired eyes, a woman she barely recognized. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she murmured. Hayes didn't move. "Tell me what really happened, Marianne." There was a long silence. Then, slowly, the truth began to bleed through the cracks. "I went there to end it," she whispered. "To say goodbye. I couldn't do it anymore. The guilt, the lies. David had found out. I thought if I told Ethan it was over, he'd understand." Hayes nodded quietly. But he didn't. Marianne's voice trembled. "He said I was choosing David over him. That I'd used him. He started yelling, saying he'd tell everyone, that he'd ruin my life. I begged him to calm down, but he kept getting louder. Tears welled in her eyes. I told him he didn't know what real love was. He grabbed my wrist. He wouldn't let me leave. I tried to push him away." Her breath hitched. Then he hit the glass table. It shattered. I thought he'd kill me." Hayes's pen paused mid-sentence. So you grabbed the knife? Marianne's silence was confirmation enough. I didn't mean to, she said finally. It was just there. I wanted him to stop. Her voice cracked on the last word. He kept coming toward me, and I swung it. The air in the interrogation room seemed to thin. Hayes's tone softened. How many times, Marianne? Marianne's lips parted, but no sound came out. She stared at her shaking hands as if they belonged to someone else. I don't know, she whispered. It happened so fast. He looked at me, like he didn't even recognize me. Then he fell. She closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. There was so much blood. Hayes switched off the recorder. The soft click echoed through the silence. You could have called us right away, Hayes said quietly, but instead, you told us David did it. Marianne nodded faintly, defeated. Because if I didn't, if people knew the truth, I'd lose everything. Hayes stood slowly, gathering the files. You already did, Marianne. As she left the room, Marianne sat frozen under the flickering light, trapped between guilt and denial. Behind the glass, another detective whispered, So, it was never him. Hayes's voice was low, certain. No. David Clark never showed up that night. By autumn, the whispers of Pine Hill Avenue had grown into headlines. The suburban scandal of Pine Hill. Every paper carried her face, pale, tear-streaked, eyes hollow under courtroom light. The woman who had once hosted backyard barbecues was now the centerpiece of a small-town tragedy. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and coffee. Reporters filled the benches, their pens ready to dissect every tremor in her voice. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, sat stiffly, eyes fixed on Marianne Clark as she took her place beside her defense attorney, her wrists trembling slightly against the polished wood of the table. Across the aisle, David Clark sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken to her since the night of the arrest. He attended every hearing, never missing a word, his silence heavier than any accusation. The prosecution began first. Assistant District Attorney Grant Myers was tall, confident, and ruthless with his words. He moved like a man who already believed in her guilt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, voice sharp as a blade, this was not self-defense. This was obsession. A calculated affair with a young man she knew she could manipulate, one that ended in blood when she lost control. He gestured to the photo board behind him, Ethan's SE, miling college portrait beside the crime scene photos. The contrast was gutting. She claims she feared for her life, Myers continued. But ask yourselves, why did only her fingerprints appear on the murder weapon? Why did she lie to police about her husband's involvement? Because she knew exactly what she'd done. Marianne's eyes dropped to the table. Her attorney, Julia Kemp, placed a hand gently over hers, a quiet reminder to breathe. When it was the defense's turn, the tone shifted. Julia's voice was calm, steady, maternal in its empathy. This is not the story of a monster, she said softly. It is the story of a woman who was broken, emotionally isolated, manipulated by both a controlling husband and a young man who blurred the line between love and obsession. She paused, letting her words settle in the air. Marianne Clark didn't plan to kill anyone. She acted in fear, in panic, in the chaos of a moment she couldn't control. A murmur rippled through the room. When Marianne finally took the stand, all eyes turned to her. The click of camera shutters echoed faintly, then faded as the judge's gavel struck once. Her voice was fragile, trembling but clear. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. I only went there to end things. But Ethan, he wouldn't let me go. I panicked. I didn't think. She swallowed hard. I just wanted it to stop. The prosecutor rose for cross-examination, his expression cold. You wanted it to stop, he repeated. But you stabbed him 3 times, didn't you? Marianne flinched. It wasn't. I didn't count. He cut her off. You told police your husband did it. You lied to cover yourself. Isn't that true? Her eyes filled with tears. I was scared, she whispered. Of what? She looked toward David, who sat unmoving, staring straight ahead. Of losing everything? Of being the woman everyone whispers about? The room was silent except for the scratch of pens and the distant hum of the air vent. The trial dragged on for days, forensic experts, psychologists, neighbors recounting fragments of gossip, each word chipped away at the illusion of her old life. By the final day, both sides rested. The judge's instructions were brief but heavy. The question is intent, not guilt of circumstance but of choice. As the jury retired to deliberate, Marianne's gaze drifted once more toward her husband. He didn't look back. The clock ticked on, merciless. Reporters whispered about verdicts and headlines yet to come. And outside the courthouse, autumn leaves swept across the steps, quiet, indifferent, as if Pine Hill had already begun to move on from her story. The rain hadn't stopped for days. It streaked down the narrow window of Marianne's prison cell like a quiet metronome, counting the hours, the regrets, the seconds left unredeemed. She sat hunched over the small metal desk, her hand trembling as she began to write. The paper was creased, edges damp from her fingertips, but it was all she had left to give. Words. Words to the 2 people she had destroyed the most. David, Emily, she began slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if you'll ever read this, or if you'll even care to, but I need to write it. For me, for the silence that's been growing inside this room. She paused, the pen hovering. The first drop of a tear splattered onto the page, mixing with the ink. For months, she had been rehearsing what she'd say if she ever saw them again. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she'd picture David, sitting in their old kitchen, the same chair where he used to drink coffee and read the paper. She imagined him still unable to look at the empty side of the bed. And Emily, their little girl who was now almost grown, the one Marianne had promised to protect from pain, but instead had handed it to her like an inheritance. I loved Ethan, she wrote next, her chest tightening. But not in the way people think. It wasn't fireworks or passion. It was something else, a shadow of what I thought love used to feel like. I was empty, David. For so long I was invisible, even to myself. Ethan made me feel seen again, but what I didn't realize was that being seen isn't the same as being whole. The memories came in flashes. Ethan's laughter, the trembling in his hands that night, the sound of glass breaking, the metallic scent of blood, the police lights painting the walls red and blue. She stopped writing, closing her eyes as if she could shut it all out. But guilt has a way of echoing, even in silence. They say the truth sets you free, she continued, but I think truth only frees those who can live with it. I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I still want you to know that I never meant for it to end this way. I wanted to run from the pain, and I ran straight into a fire I couldn't control. She folded the letter once, then unfolded it again, adding a final line in shaky handwriting. Desire feels like freedom, until it becomes your cage. Outside her cell, footsteps echoed, a guard making rounds. Marianne looked up, startled, and quickly slid the letter beneath the stack of old papers on her desk. Later that night, the letter was sealed and addressed in her neatest script. The envelope looked small, fragile, as if it might crumble under the weight of what was inside. The next morning, the prison mail cart rattled down the corridor. Marianne watched as her letter disappeared into the stack. carried away into a world she no longer belonged to. Days turned into weeks. Somewhere across town, David received the envelope. He stood at the mailbox for a long time, the faint scent of rain still on the paper. He didn't open it, not at first. He carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it through the afternoon. When he finally unfolded the pages, the ink had smudged from her tears, or perhaps his own. Emily watched from the doorway, her eyes wide but silent. As David read, Marianne's voice lingered softly through the narration. Haunting, yet tender. "Desire feels like freedom," she said, "until it becomes your cage." And with that, her story ended. Not with a scream, not with a verdict, but with the quiet surrender of someone who finally understood the price of wanting to feel alive. The rain continued to fall outside, steady, relentless, washing the past into memory.